I'd like to share with you 3 scenarios of totally unfair situations in job interviews, and maybe a little bit of behind the scenes information to help you understand what actually happens and what can you do about these situations. The first one refers to candidates knowing the questions in advance in job interviews. And I'm referring to the behavioral interview questions, because for the technical ones, if someone would receive them in advance, it would be game over for all the other candidates. It would be obvious that you prepared that and you will pass. But for the behavioral interview questions, it's not as straightforward as most candidates think, right? So first, is it common for candidates to know the questions in advance? It's not that uncommon. Unfortunately, especially for behavioral interviews, some people have some connections, some people are preferred candidates, some people are internal candidates, so they know how stuff works. So yes, some candidates do have these questions in advance. Now, what happens in my experience is that when someone receives or gets those questions, they will immediately start preparing answers specifically to those questions rather reactively. They would prepare, some star answers. They will try to template those as good as possible to try to answer the question as well as they possibly can. Okay, this is in contrast with someone preparing for real, so to speak, a behavioral interview, that is to prepare a story bank and to role play it, which is a far more qualitative approach rather than simply focusing on answering the question. So in my experience, people who do receive questions in advance and also pass job interviews also prepare for those interviews quite thoroughly. So it's not uncommon to have 10 coaching sessions with someone who already has the questions in advance, simply because they understand the value of things such as pitching the behavior behind the question when compared to delivering the answer into the star or whatever other format. Okay, so basically what I'm saying here is that knowing the questions in advance in behavioral interviews doesn't make you so much significantly likely to pass that interview when compared to someone who takes those interviews seriously. The second scenario of a totally unfair situation in job interviews is for screening rounds. And it is very common for candidates, especially in more senior types of roles, to pass screening rounds based on connections. Okay, or to pass screening rounds because they have a well-keyworded CV, because they paid someone to do their CVs, which is, unfair, so to speak, with other candidates who's, maybe would say that, hey, but why isn't this screening round a merit-based interviews? Now, what I can tell you here is 2 things. First, is the roles for which people pass screening rounds because of connections are oftentimes roles to which it matters on how well can you communicate and how well connected you are in general, how well can you communicate cross-functionally. The second thing I like to speak about here is that passing a screening round based unfairly, so to speak, based on connections, does not mean you will receive a job offer, right? There's still a final interview round. And in my experience, what happens here is people who unfairly, so to speak, pass these screening rounds, there are 2 types of candidates. The first type of candidates who think, hey, you know what, I'm really special, they really like me, it's only going to be a formality. Who think because of the fact they passed the screening round without taking it too seriously, it will be the same thing for the final interview rounds. In my experience, this is a deadly mistake and it never works, okay? And then there's the second candidate who understands that, hey, you know what, passing that screening round happened because I'm, somewhat favorite for this role, but this doesn't mean much for a final interview round. So basically what I'm saying here is that a final interview round is not a screening round. So what the levels of success in screening rounds do not matter when compared to passing final interviews as much as most candidates would think. Okay? And similarly, if you passed the screening round based on some companies, Nvidia for instance, has very technical screening rounds at first because they want to see if the candidate stands a chance. This doesn't mean that the final interview rounds will be passed solely on your subject matter, on your technical expertise, but there's going to be the behavioral side that also matters. So long story short, even if the screening rounds would be passed unfairly, this doesn't mean that candidate is so much more likely to pass that final interview round, because this is what matters to land a job offer ultimately, right? And the third scenario that I'd like to share with you here with respect to unfair events in job interviews is the example I just gave you with Nvidia. Nvidia, for instance, is screening rather technically in the beginning and then behaviorally towards the final interview rounds. So employers aren't only looking to screen you for subject matter expertise. Okay, so another example, I used to hire developers when I run a small software business. And I've been privileged enough to work with some amazing, talented people. They were super smart. They were able to do their job exceptionally well, except when you try to do something in a team context, so to speak. So cross-functional communication, right? So when you apply for a job with a high-performing company, it doesn't have to be a huge corporation, could be even a startup. There's more than your subject matter expertise that will matter. And furthermore, for more junior types of roles, behavioral interviews are exceptionally efficient at one thing, to determine on whether you took their interview seriously, because it shows if you prepared those job interviews. And to some roles, not director level roles, it does matter that you are willing to work hard to get to land that job offer. You'll be surprised that even for senior analysts for finance roles at Amazon, they do appreciate quite a lot when people prepare and invest time into the process. So what I'm telling you here is that interviews aren't only passed on your subject matter expertise, and it might sound somewhat unfair to some candidates. However, you should understand the context that you're getting into. You must, have some soft skills. You must earn their trust, so to speak, in the process, because, it's not only about subject matter expertise to pass interviews with high-performing companies. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.